Thank you for listening to the Plain State Podcast, a production of the Department of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. In this episode, Michael Page interviews celebrated science fiction author James Gunn, who, at age 96, is still publishing. Gunn reflects on his personal and professional interactions with Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, and Neil Gaiman.
Hi, this is Mike Page. I'm here in Lawrence, Kansas today. One of the grandmasters of science fiction, James Gunn, is also not only one of the finest writers in the science fiction field, but one of the foundational scholars and teachers of science fiction as well. And Jim, this is a conversation for the University of Nebraska's Plain State Podcast. And thanks so much for having me down to Lawrence again.
See you. Glad to have you here.
It's a lovely day, 70 degrees on November 8th. And I thought we'd talk a little bit about your work and career. You told me you have finished a new novel, or you're in the middle of working on a new novel?
Well, actually, it's a series of novelettes, which I've going to appear, the first two of them, in Asimov's science fiction. Sheila Williams, the editor, was gracious enough to accept both of them. And I keep trying to think of ways in which I can expand it into something that resembles a novel. And the aspects of that emerge from the novel concept keep coming up as ways of trying to resolve some of the issues. And I'm going to talk about the issues here because that would spoil the impact of the stories themselves. The first of these, which I think is going to appear next spring, is called In Our Stars. The second of these, which is going to appear in the following issue, is called Against the Stars. And I'm working on what I hope will be the third novelette, which is called Return to Earth. And it still is only going to be about 40,000 words, maybe a few more. But I hope to make it a little more respectable as a length by writing an essay about the subject matter of the novel, which is basically the issue of what if there is some other galactic mind of some sort, I don't give it away, what I think it might be, that is controlling the thoughts and attitudes and fates of human beings, because it does that. That's what it does. And if this is the case, what can we possibly do about it? So it is that I intend to write finally an essay, which I hope Asimov's magazine also will be interested in which I discuss the ways in which science fiction has over the years dealt with this issue of super ordinary controls, minds, sort of creatures that may or may not influence our behavior and our fates. Surprisingly enough, they seem to be contradictory in terms of science fiction, because science fiction really assumes that people make their own fates. In fact, the title of the first episode, In Our Stars, I quote the dialogue that Cassius has with Brutus in Julius Caesar, when he says, "The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. And I've used only the last part of that is the leave out the not. So it's really dealing with what's in our stars that may be making us underlings.
So, Jim, you're 96 years old.
Yes, and I feel it.
And if you have a kind of a new novel in the works, a new novel will eventually come out, I think you might have surpassed Jack Williamson. I know Jack lived to be 98, but yes. I don't remember when his last novel was published. I think it was about maybe 95, 96 years old.
Something like that. So I have actually 2 books on schedule to be published sometime within the next 6 months, which will make a total of 50. I'm at 48 right now.
Oh, very good.
One of the novels is a series of chapters that I revised and reimagined from my novel Transcendental that were published sequentially, sometimes 2 at a time, in Asimov's magazine, and is now going to be published as a single volume by Reanimus Press any day now. And of course, the book that I'm writing with you,
yes,
my series of essays on the protocols of reading science fiction, which emerged from a 1996 online discussion with a number of opinion makers, including Damon Knight, who, among others, eventually induced me to participate. And resulted, I thought, in a series of very provocative sort of concerns and attitudes and thoughts about the subject. And I finally found in you somebody who was willing to do the work to put all these together.
And if I recall, Reanimus Press is going to publish your back catalog, correct?
Yes, as a matter of fact.
As a James Gunn library?
At my, I had the idea that probably suggested by my agent, Kimberly Cameron, that it was time to have what she called a James Gunn library, that is a real catalog of my previously published books, which could be found in one place. And she queried 2 or 3 possible publishers, but I also pointed out to her that Andrew Burt, the head of Reanimus Press, had approached me a couple of years before about the possibility of reprinting some of my out-of-print books. And so she also got in touch with Burt. We decided at the end that he was the most interested and involved person, and we signed a contract with him, and we got the rights back to most of my titles, partly from my efforts and partly from Andrew Burt's efforts. So Reanimus Press is ready to get involved in putting together a catalog of my books.
And Jim, you told me that you are also writing an essay on Isaac Asimov. It's his 100th anniversary of Isaac Asimov.
Yeah, I was asked by Science magazine, had an email from the editor there, who asked me if I'd be willing to write an essay about Isaac for an issue a month or so in the future, since Isaac and his parents established his birthday as January the 2nd. They didn't know for sure that was his actual birthday, because he was born in a small town in Soviet Russia in 1919 or 1920. called Petrovici. And the records there being so fragmentary, when they emigrated to the United States, and when Isaac was 3 years old, they established his birth date then as January the 2nd. So that's the one that we are using as the
100th
birthday most
anniversary.
people have used. And I agreed to write the essay. But since I hadn't written for science before, I asked the editor whether she would be willing to take a look at what I wrote and offer some suggestions or editing suggestions that I could use. And she had told me originally she wanted an essay of somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 words. And so I tried to keep it succinct and pertinent, and as well as interesting, because I was always an admirer of Isaac's, and we were friends of sort, though more convention friends than other occasions. Didn't have a chance to meet that often, since we lived in different parts of the country, and Isaac didn't travel, at least he didn't fly.
Do you remember when you first would have met Isaac?
Yes, I'm sure I know it pretty well. I met him first over the Labor Day weekend of 1953.
So that was the second convention you went to?
That was the second convention I went to after the Chicago event of 1952. And it was there I met Isaac and a number of other people that I didn't have a chance to meet with before, though I had met a number of writers in Chicago. Many of them were not in Philadelphia, where the convention was held, but it was very convenient for Isaac, and so we enjoyed the occasion to meet and chat briefly. He commented about our meeting in his first volume of his autobiography. He said he met me and Phillips, was a farmer, and he said Farmer might be a better writer, but Gunn was a better looking. I don't know how to take that, but at least in later years, I met Isaac at other conventions, and on one memorable occasion, I happened to be in New York before going on to the convention in Cleveland. I think this was in the later 50s, maybe. And it turned out that Isaac was the guest of honor there. And my then publisher, Martin Greenberg, was going to drive Isaac and a couple others from New York to Cleveland. So he invited me to go along with him, and we traveled to Cleveland together, and I enjoyed conversation and spent a considerable amount of time together at the convention. And I got a chance to get better acquainted with him, and we exchanged correspondence, mostly letters on my part and postcards on his, that I found very fascinating, intriguing. He was often talking about the work he was working on. Finally, I got a little embarrassed by the fact that he was such a busy and well-published person. He must by the time he was coming out with all of his science books, and would come to something like one a month. I hated to feel like I was using up his time, so I let the correspondence drop away. But we re-met in New York when I attended the Nebula Award ceremony. Must have been in the late 70s. I had arranged to give a slide talk at the Hayden Planetarium there, and Isaac was in the audience. Matter of fact, the director of the planetarium had invited Isaac and Janet to have dinner with me before the occasion. We had a good dinner before then, and then I gave my talk, and I mentioned to Isaac afterwards that I had stopped corresponding with him because I was afraid of taking up his time, and he said, "You can write me anytime." So, but then it turned out that I felt this terrible wave of sickness come over me, and I was really sick by the time I got back to the hotel, and the next morning canceled my appointments and flew back to Kansas City, deathly ill, and turned out that I had pneumonia and was hospitalized for 3 or 4 days before they maybe got me to feeling better. But that was about the last time I really had contact with Isaac. A little before I had written my book about him, Isaac Asimov, The Foundations of Science Fiction, which involved an interview with Isaac that I made connection with at a convention, minor listener convention in New York, and we went to another place where he had an appointment, sat in the lobby, and I interviewed him on tape that I had brought along, and included that in my book. And Isaac must have read it with considerable care, because he was really a person who enjoyed reading about himself, because he shortly after that he published his first science fiction novel in a long time, which was Foundation's Edge. And he wrote about it in his editorial in Asimov's magazine, and among other things said that it was reading a passage in my book about him that enabled him to have the courage to go on. I think it was something about the fact that he wrote his scenes on sort of a bare stage and mostly dealt with the ideas and the transformation of ideas. And he said, I read that and I told myself I could do that. Yeah. So he gave me credit for inspiring his ability to continue, which sort of made me feel good, because most writers who have books written about them, about their work, don't like them and resent them and find things to dislike about them.
Yeah.
And in this case, I felt that Isaac had given it credit for making his writing possible. So.
Well, Jim, let's see. You're home here in Lawrence. You've had a number of guests here. I remember the story you told me. Arthur C. Clarke was he a guest in this home?
No,
or your other
actually, he was two homes before this.
Oh, okay.
And the house, we had an old house.
Was that in 68?
Down on Mississippi in 65.
65.
66, I'm sorry. It was 1966 was the centennial of the university. And we had a program, a number of things that were going on that year, including the premiere of a new opera that had been written for the occasion called Carrie Nation by Douglas Moore. And we were living in this big old house down on Mississippi Street. It was more than 100 years old then. And the event that Arthur Clarke was coming for was called the Intercentury Seminar, which was a 4-day series of lectures and presentations that had the unusual aspect of putting on the stage with the speaker 3 other members of the speaking group, who would then sort of discuss the presentation the speaker had made. And we had some excellent speakers who lined up, and the person who really originated the idea and carried out most of the work on it was the chair of the speech and drama department, Professor Bill Conboy. But I was the director of university relations, and I was involved in a way with the occasion, and helped get a lot of promotion for it, for which I was lucky. The local Associated Press correspondent spent all 4 days here and posted stories about the talks that were being made. But anyway, my wife and I went over to Kansas City to pick up Arthur at the airport and brought him back to Lawrence and into our capacious old house and sat him down in the living room, fixed him a cup of tea, and he told us about his work with Stanley Kubrick on 2001, which he had just completed, and he brought a number of stills from the filming that he told us about. He particularly liked one which had the instructions for using the zero gravity toilet, and but he also told us about what he considered to be somewhat difficulties he had run into with Stanley Kubrick, and that his contract had arranged for his payment to be made in writing the novelization of the movie, but which was supposed to be a sort of a illicit collaboration. But Kubrick didn't want to release it yet. And so he was, of course, eventually it came out as a very successful novel. But he also, still remember, we had, Jane had picked up at an auction a old-fashioned spectroscope with something like 50 different slides in it, which you inserted in the speaker and looked at them, saw them in 3D. And Arthur looked at the box and said, "Do you have a picture of the moon on it?" I said, "Oh, I don't think so." And he leafed through it and found the picture of the moon and put it in the spectroscope and looked at it. I thought it was fascinating. He was able to put his fingers
right to it
on something that we had not even thought about. But Stanley was excellent, a little formal guest, and he had was not as well as he would have liked. He thought he had aftermath of a diving accident, or run into some difficulty with his breathing apparatus, but it may have been from some childhood polio experience. But he did well and gave a nice, interesting talk. Was one of the highlights of the centennial. So it was a good chance to meet entertain one of the leading writers.
Yeah.
I was never able to get Isaac Asimov to come out, even though we're always on good terms, because he said he didn't fly and it would take too much time to travel on the train.
Did Ray Bradbury ever come through here?
Yes, he did. He made a speaking tour late in his career, and I remember talking to or the dean of the college, I guess, who was, yes, the dean of the college. He was involved with inviting him, and I asked if we could have him talk to a class, and she wrote back, said, no, but could you come to the dinner we're having for him? So I joined him for dinner and sat beside him. And
had you met him at other times before?
I had, though, mostly at the Writers of the Future occasions when they began inviting me for several years to be present for the award ceremony, and I think at the time that they were interested in the fact that I had been named to the organizing committee for the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame in Seattle that was under construction. And I think they kept hoping that I would be able to get L. Ron Hubbard into the Hall of Fame, until I finally told them I really didn't have any influence on that. And so they stopped inviting me. But at each of these Writers of the Future occasions, they would have an evening celebration, a reception of sorts, on the top floor of the Celebrity Center they held there in Hollywood, which is an old hotel, a famous hotel, and it had a big roof. And Bradbury often would be there on the occasion, as well as a lot of other celebrities. And I had occasion to speak to him there once or twice. But when we were sitting beside each other at the dinner, which is held at the old Pachamama's restaurant before they moved downtown, and then later, and he said, were you ever at my house? And I said, no, Ray, I was never invited.
Now, that reminds me, last year, Neil Gaiman was a guest here in Kansas. I don't think I've asked you, did you get a chance to
As
visit
a matter of
with
fact,
Gaiman?
I was, I heard that he was going to come, and I think I was invited to the reception that was given him before for his talk.
Mm-hmm.
And I accepted it, and I was just went in and sat down, I think, with Chris and Kidge at the table, among some other people. But then Gaiman was very friendly. After he came in, someone must have identified me. He came over and shook my hand and told me what an honor it was, and I reciprocated and told him it was a great honor to have him here. And then, we all went in and listened to his talk in the lead auditorium. And he gave a very fascinating talk. I was really partly reading and partly commentary, but he was a very lively and entertaining and in some ways profound speaker. I was really glad that I felt up to going out there listening to him.
Special thanks to James Gunn and Michael Pate. Plain State is produced by Robert Lipscomb. Post-production by Stephen Ramsey. Music by Shadows on a River. My name is Jack Mullity. On behalf of the Department of English at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, thank you for listening to the Plain State Podcast. Tagline forthcoming.